So tonight is our final instalment of our series, The Works of Mercy, which started, you won't believe this, it started 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks ago, and actually we've travelled quite a long way in that time and had an amazing group of speakers. But tonight we're looking at the final one, which is called Bury the Dead. Bury the Dead. So just to remind you, actually I shouldn't have put this up. I should have asked you. Can you tell me what are the other feed the hungry,
drink to the thirsty,
drink to the thirsty,
Visit the prisoner,
visit the prisoner,
the homeless, comfort the sick.
comfort the sick. Yes. Have we missed any?
There was an introduction.
And there was an introduction. That's right. And we've done so: hungry, thirsty, naked, homeless, sick, captive,
stranger.
Welcome the stranger. Absolutely right. And then finally, it is bury the dead. Now you may wonder, that's a bit odd, isn't it? Bury the dead, because it doesn't fit in with the different forms of what we've been talking about, with which you find in Matthew. It seems a slightly odd one, whereas, you know, all the rest, you can see that there's someone in a kind of need, and you come alongside them and you help them, but actually you've got a dead person, sort of beyond help in a sense, you know. So why is it there? And that's what we're going to have a little think about tonight. And we go back to our Aquinas. So it wasn't actually Aquinas who added it on, but what Aquinas did was he talked very much about mercy in his Summa Theologica. And there he was trying to find out, what does mercy actually mean? And during that 13th century scholastic time, there was a great yearning to use our reason, all our faculties, to try and find out what our faith was all about, what was God really like, and using this attribute of reason to really look at it. And so he started thinking very much about, well, what is mercy? And if you remember, right at the beginning of our talk, we actually started in that introduction trying to describe, well, what is mercy? So what Thomas Aquinas did, he defined mercy as the virtue. It was a virtue, one of the virtues. And he described it as the compassion in our hearts for another person's misery, a compassion which drives us to do what we can to help them, which is quite a good actual definition, isn't it? It's something within us that drives us to do something. But he said that there were two different types of mercy. He said that there was, first of all, affective mercy and effective, one with an A and one with an E. Okay. And he argued that the human virtue of mercy necessarily will be both affective and effective. However, for it to be authentic mercy, it must manifest two additional characteristics. The first is it must be rooted in reason. Reason, as I said, that is, in the truth about the sufferings of others and what is in fact the objective good for the other whom we seek to help. So he's basically saying that that mercy has to have this dimension. Either you're doing it because you're feeling good about yourself, okay, and so the good, the reasoning of the higher good is you're doing it for yourself. Okay, but then he's saying the higher good than that is not to do it for yourself, but to do it purely for the good of the person, the good of the other person. And that's where he said, secondly, the virtue of mercy is proven in effective action for the good of others as circumstances permit. So if we merely sympathise with the plight of another. So we have pity with someone and share their pain without making the best of the opportunities we have to help them, then virtue of mercy does not abide in us in any significant degree. So what he's basically saying is that it's no point just having the heart of compassion for another person or mercy. You have to have the hands too. So affective is what you feel inside. Effective is the effecting of mercy. So that's what he's saying. So there's no point us all sitting and watching the television going, oh, I'm feeling really sorry for these people, if we then actually don't go and do something, because that is the real mercy that is then linked to God. Does that make sense? Yes. Aquinas is very dense. So that's what he's playing around at, is basically he's trying to get about what are the motivations for us to do something good to other people. Okay. And then you think, well, what on earth does burying the dead have involved in all this? Okay. Then he tries to link it back. Okay. So he thinks about mercy within human beings. Okay. And then he thinks about, so are what we do, what we do as people, are we doing it out of our own motivation? Or are we doing actually out of something that enacts God's mercy? So that there's something that flows through us into the mercy of God, which is then effected. So pretty much why we called this whole series Being the Hands and the Heart of Christ. And he writes, mercy is mercy the greatest of the human virtues? On the other hand, when we consider which of the virtues should govern our relationships with other human beings, then it is clear that mercy directed to our neighbours in need is the supreme mercy in man. Hence mercy and charity. Secondly, he asks the question, is mercy the greatest attribute of God? Okay. Since God is the absolute superior, the perfect and self-existent creator, St. Thomas says he is never self-seeking, but acts only and always with selfless generosity, pouring out good gifts out of his abundance on his creatures. Showing mercy is therefore proper to God in a very special way, for it manifests his infinite perfection and his infinite abundance and generosity. This is him quoting, if we consider a virtue in terms of its possessor, however, we can say that mercy is the greatest of the virtues only if its possessor is himself the greatest of all beings, with no one above him and everyone beneath him. This, of course, is properly true only of God himself. So it's very dense. So what he's saying there is a desire to act towards other people is the highest virtue in human beings. So that means in God, the highest attribute that God can have is the self-pouring of himself on his creation. And of course, we often call that in terms of love and charity. But what Aquinas equates it to is this act of mercy. So when we act mercifully, we are actually like do you remember, who was it? Nick said, we are acting as a conduit of grace. So that's very dense, okay? But this is where all this stuff about the acts of mercy comes from, all the teasing out of it by Aquinas. So we've got a bit of a better idea. So that doesn't say very much for where bury the dead fits in. You have to think that this is the time of the 13th century. We are the height of scholastic theology, scholasticism. Now, scholasticism within theology was very much wanting, as I was saying, bringing reason, but also bringing in systems and ideas and finding patterns And so one of the great systematizations that was used was actually through the pastoral offices. So if you think about confession and all those aspects of the pastoral offices, there was a desire to help people understand their motivations for doing things by having systems and keys and headings and subheadings and subsets of subsets. So you went to your priest and you said, I have sinned. You didn't just say, I have sinned. You could absolutely nail down exactly what you did, why you did it, what the species was, what the action was, and it was. So you're really trying to pin it all down. And that's where we get the bury the dead coming in. Because during this scholastic system, one of their favourite numbers was 7. So if you can think for a moment, how many 7s are there, not only in the Bible, but in the church? I'll give you a clue. 7 last words to the cross. 7 days of creation. 7 virtues. 7 vices. 7, and you can go on and on and on. 7 spiritual acts. 7 corporeal acts. Now this is really interesting because the spiritual acts are like the mirror of the corporeal acts. So the spiritual acts, we could do another whole series just on the spiritual acts. And they're to do with your inner life. The corporeal acts are to do with your body. And that's what we've been looking at, the bodily mercy, the 7 corporeal acts of mercy, they're called. So the 7 spiritual acts of mercy end with tending the dead. So you're looking after the dead. So the mirror to that will be, in a physical way, burying the dead. Justification for this was found in Tobit. Okay? So Tobit, which is in the Apocryphal Bible, and if you remember, it's all about an angel. Yeah, very nice. And there's this very lovely passage where it says, in the days of Shalmaneser, I performed many acts of charity to my kindred, those of my tribe. I would give my food to the hungry and my clothing to the naked. And if I saw the dead body of any of my people thrown out behind the wall of Nineveh, I would bury it. So for people like our scholastic theologians and all those, those people who are setting out their schema, there you got your 7th one. You've got all the rest from Matthew, and this one comes in for the 7th act of mercy. And that's how it gets included into the list in the Middle Ages. Because tending the dead, if you think about it, was already really deeply important within the culture of the Old Testament, but also it goes all the way back. If you think of some of the, some of those amazing Bronze Age burials, or Wayland Smithy, and all those places, that was where the dead were honoured and buried. I mean, invariably those kind of places were for the chieftains, the important people. But right back in the Old Testament, we have lots of examples of people tending and looking after the dead. So I've just put a few examples here. The importance of proper burial can be seen in Genesis 23, when Abraham, who is living among the Hittites, purchases a field in which to bury his wife Sarah. And Genesis 49:31 informs us that Abraham will also be buried in that tomb, as will Isaac and his wives Leah and Rebekah and their son Jacob. So that is a place, and you'll find that that's very much connected with family. It's the family who are going to look after and bury the dead in that place. So having a plot where you could put your family and you would put them each time is a very much a thing to pass down and to do. The importance of a proper burial is also seen in the interment of Joshua and the bones of Joseph. Proper burial of the dead was considered so important in Israel that being left unburied was considered a curse under condemnation. And that links back to why in Tobit it says, if I see a dead body left, I, even if I'm not related to that person, will go and bury that dead. So then it becomes an act of mercy, not just to your family, but an act of mercy to another person, because it was considered a curse. In Deuteronomy, then, if it's so awful, you can also have where all the curses for disobeying God's commands are listed. This curse is found. Your corpses will become food for all the birds of the air and for the beasts of the field, with no one to frighten them off. And if you remember what happens to poor Jezebel when she's thrown out, you know, the dogs will lick up your... So it was seen as the greatest curse, actually, not to have that proper burial and tending. Then we move on to the New Testament. And of course, you can already probably think of many different examples of where we have the dead being looked after and tended. The most powerful, of course, is the deposition of Christ and the wrapping of his body, anointing by the women. Again, these were the closest people to Jesus. It wasn't a professional who came in. These were the closest people to Jesus who would actually be tending the person who had died as an act of love and an act of mercy. And there are several other noticeable burials in the New Testament. The one is John the Baptist, once he's been beheaded, and it's his disciples who go and take him away, took away the corpse, and then they buried him. So this is, as I say, a much wider, not just the family now. It's actually those people who followed John. And when Lazarus died, his body was wrapped in burial bands, his face wrapped in a cloth and laid in a tomb. And after Stephen was stoned, it was the devout men who buried Stephen. Devout men. We're not quite sure what that means, devout men. Whether it means actually it was the people who were very holy, or whether that was actually a term of phrase for, maybe it was a more professional. Which links us through to today. So things are a little bit different to today. Those of us who are priests, it's our kind of job to bury the dead. But you'll notice, and this sprung out to me very much at the ordination service that we had the other week. So there's this whole load of stuff which tells us what we should do to be good priests. And one of them, it says, they are to minister to the sick and prepare the dying for their death. That sprung out at me because it doesn't actually say, and you will bury the dead. It says, you will prepare the dying for their death. And if you think about it, that act of walking with someone or anointing someone when they are dying, walking with them and being able to hold their hand, even when they can't speak, and reassuring them that God loves them, that is the kind of the ministry that you're giving to another person. You're not really ministering to that person so much when they're actually dead. It's a different kind of ministry then. So today, it's actually become a lot more professionalised. I don't know if any of you have had experience of someone having died in close proximity, because it is very much. I remember somebody. I buried her husband. And I remember that she just sat with her husband for a while because he had died. Just for a while, because she also knew that the minute she rang the doctor, he would go. He would be taken away from her. And she just wanted to sit with him in peace for a while, just the two of them. And then she rang the doctor, and then of course all the professionals come in, and that's we've lost something about that. We've lost something today, where actually the process of being, well, certainly in our culture, but there are other places in the world where it's slightly more different and the family are much more involved. But here in England, it's much more like the dead are sort of taken off scene very quickly and let's not really talk about it, And you have then to go and see the professionals, who are the funeral director and the priest, if you want that, or the chaplain, or the humanist, or the solicitor, and all those different, or the police, or if it has to go to coroner, all those different professional ways that distance the people from the loved one who has died. And of course, it's not just burying the dead today. There's 100. I looked up on the internet, and there was 23 different ways that you can that you can do with your body. Yes, exactly. Yes, just say it. Yeah. So of course, there's the funeral directors, and there's the burial. But of course, we have cremation, which everyone knows. Some people are still mummified. You can still get your body, yes, it's true, Jonathan, you can get your body mummified. You can have a tree planting. You can have a woodland burial. You can have a scattering of ashes on a hillside or somewhere like that. You can have a sky burial. Well, I'm not sure I quite like this one. So you leave the body out and let the birds and eat it, basically. You can have a woodland burial. You can have a space burial. You can actually be buried in space. You can have a sea burial, and you can have something which is called promession, which is basically like not so much, sort of chemicals and stuff dissolve the body. And it's quite popular with eco-friendly.
And Desmond Tutu.
Really?
Yeah. Yes.
I didn't even know. And of course, you can have crinoptics. Crinoptics? Well, you could be frozen. So there's a lot of choice out there about different ways in which we can bury our dead, and that speaks to me about people actually choosing how they want their remains, what they want to happen to their remains. Whereas what we've been talking very much so far is that it's the family who then gather round and lay the dead to rest. Whereas it's like, well, I want to decide how my body is going to be disposed of. And I suppose it slots in very well with our kind of individual, thinking about how we want this to be done for us. It's not other people who decide it. And of course, this there are many people who for whom none of this is. We've been talking about, I suppose, in this is probably America and in Britain and the different ways. But of course, there are some people who die under absolutely tragic circumstances. This is a picture. I don't know if you can see this picture. I found this picture, okay, and. Because Caroline Virgo, she was talking at the Refugee Week about a cemetery which is behind the it's in Sicily, the municipal cemetery. I can't speak tonight. Catania.
Isn't it near Catania?
Catania. I can't speak tonight. Thank you very much. You rescued me. And this has been dedicated to those people who've died at sea, the migrants who have died at sea. And if you look at it, it's just like a wasteland with just little pot markers where their bodies are buried. There are no names, there's no family, there's no remembering. It's utterly devastating, and she spoke very profoundly about seeing this, and just it brought it really home to her of all the people. So the International Organization for Migration said that 24,144 people have died or gone missing during attempts to cross the Mediterranean since 2014. And the United Nations Agency says that 24,000 people have died again or gone missing, and no one knows what happens to their bodies. Their families don't know what happens to their bodies, and it is then to the state to actually lay them to rest, which I think is, and these are called, where I looked this up, these called this area the Martyrs of the Sea. So we've been talking all about, how do you tend to your dead and how do you look after them? And for some of the most desperate and for some of the most poorest, actually what happens is they end up just being put aside in a small space, and it is the state who has to do that. And for me, this feels like a real act of mercy, a real act of kindness to do something.
It's a very big space, isn't it?
Yes.
In a town.
Yes.
But you wonder if it turns into a playground.
You wonder if it might in the future.
It looks like a playground.
It does look like a playground, yeah. And yet under here, with all these are where people have been laid to rest.
But that's symbolic.
Yeah.
It's that the bodies are not there because they probably disappeared in the sea.
Well, I think it's a combination of both, isn't it? Some who have died at sea, and this is the marker to mark it, and then some people who they have
Just the memory of
brought up from the, yeah. So, and I thought the other thing that's really made us all think about this act of burying the dead was, of course, during COVID, and the horrendous situation that so many families were in when they couldn't actually go and attend a funeral, or when the priest couldn't be there. And there are so many examples of that, and all the people who were affected by COVID, and in a deep way, by not being able to go through that process of being able to lay their loved ones to rest. This picture is actually from the Ebola pandemic in 2015. And I find this it's very sad, whereas actually the people have to put, all the protective material on, and then they're the only people who are there. And yet there's still that kind of act of dignity, trying to give dignity to another person, even in the most horrendous circumstances. And I've just gone through some of the amount of people who have died in great pandemics. So in the Black Death in 1347, 75 to 200 million, it was thought, died. And often a lot of them were priests, because priests would go and tend to the dying, and then would catch the bubonic plague and then die themselves. Then there's the Great Plague of 1665. 100,000 alone died in London. Horrendous. Influenza of 1918. The global number. I think this is the Spanish flu, isn't it? 50 to 100 million. Terrible. SARS 2003. Again global. 747,000. Ebola. 2015, 10,000, just over 10,000. And in England alone, 226,278. So I think looking at those figures, it makes you realise that actually, you know, not only is laying our loved ones to rest really, really important, to give someone that dignity at the end of their life, but also in pandemic terms, when it is that amount of people who are dying, how it actually becomes an act of mercy for all of us involved. It's not just about my relative or the person I'm related to. It actually affects all of us. It's like a national kind of need to recognise those people who have sadly died in. So again, we moved from just a family to the disciples to professionals being involved, but I think through COVID we've gone back to this idea that actually it's the family who are really the most important around that time. So I was thinking then finally, when we talk about an act of mercy, the burying the dead and an act of mercy, it makes me think that yes, it is an act of mercy to lay someone to rest. That is an act of mercy. But what is more an act of mercy is to care for the grieving who are looking after the loss of their loved ones, who are grieving. That is the act of mercy that all of us can actually show for other people. And if you think about it, the funeral service begins with all these lines of comfort and reassurance. They're all directed not to the person who has died, but to the living in front of you. You know, this is the act of mercy that pulls compassion out of us, that makes us want to actually say, no, I just want to hold your hand, I just want to walk with you, while you actually are the ones who put your loved ones to rest. It's not the priest who does the burial. It's not, it's you, it's the family. So how do we show an act of mercy? Well, we all know what it's like when someone who we are close to is going through grieving, and we all know that terrible thing of, well, what do we say? You know, what do we say? Will I get it wrong? Will I say something wrong? You know, and I think this is where all of us, when we have a little bit of compassion and courage and think, well, if I'd lost my grandma, what would I like that person over there to do? You know, or just come and sit with me, or just ask if I'm okay. Or, you know, 2 years later, around the time when I lost my husband, just remembered that that was the time when I lost my husband. And I think those little things are how we actually reveal that loving kindness and mercy of God, who wants to really care for those who are so sad and so struggling, and who need people around to actually help and bring them back and remind them that life goes on, and to remind them that God is good and is bigger than life and death, and that their loved one is with God, and it's okay. They're okay. So we said that we would come to the full end of our series, that we'd have a little reflection on the whole of the series. And this is really kind of an opportunity for you just to reflect. I've pulled out a few of the things that have kind of jumped out to me as we've travelled along. The first one is, it feels to me that nearly every week, every speaker was living out that golden rule, you know, love thy neighbour as you love thyself. That seemed to be, love God and love your neighbour as yourself, that they were actually living out the reality of that in very different ways. that's striking. I think it was Kirili in the sermon on refugee, where you make that striking comparison between compassion, not pity. So compassion is something that as we say, that God-given compassion that flows out for the good of another, whereas pity is like, well, I'm okay, I'm just a bit sad for you, isn't it? You know, and just getting that difference, I think, is really helpful, because for me, it stops to make me think, you know, when are the times am I just sort of quite happy where I am, and I'll pity you, but actually I won't do anything about it. And then trying working with that to say, no, that's not what I should be thinking. I should be thinking more in a compassionate way and coming alongside. The next one is a number of people have said to us how important it is about not being doing things to, but being with, walking alongside. And I think that came out very well with Jo and her work with those people who lived on the streets. That wonderful image that Nick used last week of conduits of grace. I think that's such a powerful, you know. And I was thinking about a conduit of grace, you know, that when, particularly in the sense of being compassionate and having mercy for those who have lost a loved one. In a sense, if we stop thinking about ourselves and just allow ourselves to be a conduit of grace, then God gives us the words and shows us what we can do to draw near to another and reveal his mercy. The other thing I was thinking of was that it seemed to me that the different works of mercy fell into two camps. One which was a kind of a being with, you know, where you draw alongside and you just listen. I think Nick brought that out really well last week. You just listen and you walk with a kind of a contemplative sort of act of being with another. And then there are others where it's much more about doing action. And I was thinking about the people from Canterbury, you know, Dominica with the refugees. So there's these two aspects of it, of action and contemplation, of heart and hands that are needed across society, which is probably why the works of mercy work so well, because they encompass all of that. And then finally, how I think everybody has shown that it's not something you do on your own, that you do it with other people. There's a community of faith, and it's the faith community who enable things to happen. And being part of something bigger than yourself actually enables and effects some kind of change and goodness and compassion. And finally, I've just thought that there's that notion, I think it was Jonathan who said it in his introduction, about every single person is a child of God. There's not me who's rich and you who's poor. I've got the house and you haven't. You know, I've got a nice home and you're a refugee. Everyone is a child of God, and that God sees us all completely equally as a dignified child of God, and how we make sure that whoever we meet, you know, whether they're a prisoner, a refugee, or whoever, that there is that, you know, you are a child of God as much as I am, if not more, because Jesus loved those people who were struggling most. So those are just some of the things I picked out, but I wonder if you have any thoughts about this series. You know, what did you like, or what spoke to you? What really, what was it like going through? Because I think not many of you have been to all of them. You know, so what was it like to travel through those different speakers and those different reflections? Any thoughts?
There's a book I've been called The Name of God is Mercy.
Do you want me to come? Shall I come over with a little microphone?
Walk over here. You don't need to take it off.
Oh, okay.
I say, there's a book, I think, called The Name of God is Mercy, and all the things we've said, but I'm left wondering how often the Christian message comes across as saying that, or God is merciful if you do the right thing.
Yeah, I think that's really good, because we so often, don't we equate you're completely right, because I often think of mercy is I've been a bad girl and I'm deserving of punishment and I've been let off the hook, and that is what God's mercy is like. That's the kind of church way we get about thinking, but that's got nothing to do with what we've been talking about. Yeah. And maybe, I don't know, what do you think we should do? What do you think we should do about that?
Bit of theological education, I think.
Absolutely right. Maybe we need to go back to Aquinas, oh no. Yeah, it's true. It's very good, yeah. Anyone else? Any thoughts?
There are many millions of people who are doing acts of mercy, who are not part of the Christian tradition, or indeed any religious tradition at all. So we don't have, there's no monopoly on this. It feels like a really profound human instinct as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And I suppose part of what we would say is that, God doesn't say, well, I'm only going to do good in the world through the people who are Christians. I'm going to do good in the world. And I think that there is, so yeah, absolutely. And I would hate it if we had that awful narrow view of God that, he's only going to work with this little group over here because, God is so much bigger than that, surely. And you're right, there are lots of wonderful, good acts going through. God works his wonders through human beings, I think. Yeah. Anyone else? Sorry.
Just a common thread for me, Emma, was that people, in talking about acts of mercy that were specific to their calling or their activity, received as much as they gave. Yes. And that in every case, to give was to receive.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there you are. That's scripture, isn't it? It's true. It is true.
Just a common theme.
Yeah.
And I think generally there was this wonderful, heartening demonstration of people actually sort of sublimating themselves to give to others. And there was wonderful examples of that, which I think, when we look at the world and the stories that come and we think, oh, it's grim, it's dismal, and all these fantastic things are happening quietly. Yeah. So that, I think, was very good. It came across very well.
Yeah, I agree. I was astonished with just how much goodness is going on.
And they enjoyed what they're doing.
But we don't know about it.
I know, but the joy that came from the speakers, they weren't jaded, and they demonstrated God's grace so beautifully and humbly. Yeah.
And it's because of that it's authentic, isn't it? Because it rings true. I have seen God in that person, because I know that how God works, and I know that actually that's the riches that he gives to people who do that and are there for him. And it's also the spine-tingling sort of,
And it came out of their very eloquent speaking, which again is the passion that they have for what they do.
Yeah. True, Joe.
Going back 2 points. A lot of the organisations, and Domenica's people she's working with for refugees, have got people of all faiths and no faith at all working together. And it's the support for the refugees is certainly not limited to Christians. And actually, if you go to look at you haven't got the full text of Aquinas, but if you look it up, you'll find that when he comes to discussing what misericordia is, it's not just Christian authors he quotes. He quotes, I think, Sallust, for example, the Roman historian. So what you've got there is, his point is that this is God working through the redeeming love of the Father and Son, working through the office of the Holy Spirit throughout the whole world, and that everyone has the capacity to understand some of this and to pick it up. And you don't have to be a theologian, you don't have to be a philosopher. Everyone, according to Aquinas, has this basic understanding. And I think this is actually a rather important point. Lastly, one other thing is, I think in the world we now live in, where so few people, such a small number of people really are fully exposed to the Gospels. And people will possibly be more likely to come to Christ through getting involved in good works. And there's a very good example. This is President Obama's speech at Notre Dame University, which you can find on the internet, where he discusses how he became a Christian. He said his family did engage in good works. He got involved in good works in Chicago, and he found himself working with Christians. He said, that is how I came to Christ. So, and I think, that we need to be quite clear. The flow is not necessarily belief, therefore do good works, but do good works, come into contact with people with belief, and that's where you acquire belief.
Absolutely, I agree with you very much, Joe, and I think sometimes it's like what you were saying, Ted, that sometimes I think we as a church forget what we're really here for. That actually we're here to be the conduits of grace, but we're also here to serve. That is the point of the church, to serve the world, not to be quite so self-serving. And I think the more that we are, this reflects what we are as a church, the more I think people will say, gosh, there is a point to the church. And I can see that through the shining faces of these people who are doing these things out of their love of God and their love of humanity and their compassion and mercy. I want to know about that too. But I think sometimes we can compartmentalize, well, some people do those bits, and actually the church will just be about a Sunday morning or about the liturgy, or and we can disconnect it from actually our service of the world. So I think that's what you say is really, really important. Yeah. Anyone else? Yes. Oh, I'm coming.
Could I go back to your burying the dead?
Yes.
You were talking about what's happened over
Yes.
time, but at the moment people seem much more to want a service of thanksgiving and not a funeral.
Yeah.
Any thoughts about that?
It's really interesting. That's a really interesting question. I will ponder that. I think what my gut says to answer that is that what I have seen, and what I haven't been in ministry very long, but I have seen that a shift from the funeral being seen as there for the family to it actually being there for the dead person. So that actually what you're doing at the funeral, you see, you're trying to use readings and you're trying to use music to actually comfort the people in the space, that their loved one is okay, that they'll see them again, that they're safe. And then you use the sort of, and remember the good things, remember, hold on to that. But it's very much, the funeral service very much, I found, was laying the dead to rest in a very structured way that held the grief of the people there. What I find now with sort of funeral plans is it's more about, I want to celebrate this individual's life. So it's trying to get the right person to speak the right words, so that they're given a proper kind of obituary, and that they have everything that would reflect what that person loved. Now, there's nothing wrong with either of them. There's nothing wrong with either of them. But you and I probably know that when you have a funeral, the funeral is a containment, a structure for abject misery, you know, really awful. It's really hard to celebrate a person's life when you're feeling just on the edge of crying. And what used to happen was you'd have the funeral, and then about 6 months later, you'd have the Thanksgiving. But I think people wanting to put it first, you're saying, you sure you want to do that? And I wonder whether, you know, whether we've actually helped people to think through, you know, and I've seen, you know, I've seen lots of people who want to be cheerful, but actually, you know, and you just want to go, you know, and say, look, we'll do that bit more down the line, when actually you can stand up and you can say all the lovely things about people. But there's something about they only want to do it once and that's the end as well. Does that ring true, do you think?
I wonder if it's to do with people, a lot of people just don't have much familiarity with churches or what might happen at a traditional funeral. And they don't know that a funeral can do that heavy lifting stuff when it's so raw that you don't know what to do or what to plan. And maybe people just don't know the power of that.
I think you're absolutely right.
And I think actually taking a funeral of, say it's been a difficult death or a tragic death, and people have opted for a church funeral, the structure of the funeral is hugely comforting because it does hold it. And I think it's both and, but I think we also have a role, if people elect to come to church as priest, to actually help that sort of discernment, not just sort of, you know, ticking the box and going through the motions, but really sort of if there's the opportunity to tease it out with people, because there's so much sort of cultural imposition for things that they see on television and things like that, that this is how you have a funeral, okay? And it's not. You know, so I think we have quite a pivotal role.
We do have a pivotal role, and I think the pivotal role is not talking to the people who it's not talking to the people who are going to die. No. You know, I know that there are some of these grave talk, you know, gatherings where you can go and talk and you can hear about what will happen, and then you can plan your funeral, which is fantastic. But actually, the people we need to be talking to are the families. You know, the families who have someone who they think is not long for this world, and saying, have you talked to them about dying? And invariably say, no, we don't want to talk about that, it's too morbid, you know. So in a sense, our opportunities to talk through with people are becoming less and less and less and less. Yeah, and I suppose it's how do we enable that conversation? You know, to help people, you know, realise, as you say, that that there's real help there. Yes. But I found that with all of them actually, that the Christian faith gave a lot of help, really helped. You know, having faith really helped all the aspects that we've been talking about. Yeah. So the bell's ringing. We usually take that as a well, thank you. Thank you very much for coming to the series. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know Johnny and I have very much enjoyed it, and we've enjoyed bringing the cathedral and the diocese together, and just sort of show that we're not two separate organisations. That actually, you know, we're one and the same. And I've loved being able to really celebrate here all the good work that the diocese is really doing. So thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Good.